Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Chulos. I'm the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, and I am very happy this afternoon to welcome you to these student research presentations. For those of you who don't know, last summer is the first time that the College of Liberal Arts offered summer research grants for undergraduate students. And the idea behind these grants was to provide undergraduate students an opportunity to engage in a research project of their own, something that would be apart from the requirements in their programs or in their departments. And 5 students were granted research awards for the summer. And so today we will be hearing from some of those students. You may wonder, why is it important to have a research presentation like this? There are a number of reasons. The students have already completed their research, they've already written reports. And I think we're all comfortable to some degree with written work. But it's really important once you move on, whether you go on to graduate school or you enter the work world and start a career, it's really important to know how to present, because almost every career you can choose, there will be many moments for you to present something. And it's good to have practice in an environment like the university, where in my mind, it's a safe environment. As I like to tell my students in the past, the worst you can do is get a bad grade. And this is not a graded performance today, by the way, but the worst you can do is get a bad grade. When you get out in the work world, the stakes are much higher. So I think this is a great opportunity for students, and I hope you enjoy this afternoon's presentations. I wanna tell you that I gave each student strict instructions about how to present today. And the first one has to do with time. So each student will have a total of 15 minutes allotted to them, and I'm the timekeeper, so I will interrupt when time is up. If we were in person, I would have a way of very easily and discreetly indicating, there's a minute left, but we won't use that method today. So I've asked the students to give a brief 10-minute overview of their research and plan and their findings. It's not a lot of time, but I think it's a good exercise. And then to leave 5 minutes at the end of their presentation for questions from the audience. So that means all of you who are here today should feel not only welcome to ask questions, but almost an obligation to ask questions, right? Okay, I have not heard these presentations, so I'm going to take my own notes so that I remember, and then I'll put down some questions at the same time. So first presenter today is Isaiah Brown, whose faculty advisor for this project was Halcyon Lawrence. And what I would like you to do, Isaiah, if you could tell everyone your major and then tell them the title of your project and then begin your presentation. So Isaiah, it's your turn. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Isaiah Brown. I'm currently seeking a degree within the Bachelor's of Science with an English major, literature track, and a minor in German. And my summer research project is called Sprichst du Deutsch, Making Sense of Translation Errors of Google Translate for Second Language Learners of German. May I share my screen now?
Yes, do I need to give you that authority? Let's see, who can share? All panelists. All right, see if that'll work now. Thanks.
Okay. So for some context, Google Translate was initially designed as a word-by-word translator launched in 2006. Google Translate is the most famous artificial intelligence translation tool used across the globe. Whether you're within a language-based course or simply seeking a quick translation, odds are you're going to come across this artificial intelligence. My motivation for pursuing this project that documents Google Translate and its flaws derives from my journey with the German language. I've been studying German and taking classes to pursue the minor since 2017. Also, I find it interesting to understand when Google Translate is going wrong and how I can better the system. As a result of my journey, I came up with the research question: what are the types of errors that occur with Google Translate when moving from English to German and German to English? And these are the steps within my method. First, I peer-reviewed articles and made an annotated bibliography to gain insight on the types of research and problems already documented with Google Translate. Second, I wrote the literature review. Third, I collected data by asking 4 participants to translate German to English and English to German sayings, then compared their 25 German and English translations to Google Translate and its translation for the same sayings. Fourth, I documented and analyzed categories and the various errors witnessed during data collection. So the following data is yellow since it is all documented errors. This is where the 3 participants, Google Translate and I, all have our translations compared side by side for the various phrases. As you can see, the column with the phrases is all the way to the left. Following it after that is my translations. And then to the right are the 3 participants and their columns for the translations with the same phrases. After the participants follows Google Translate and its translation for the phrases. And all the way to the right, the errors can be documented through the error type column. And for us, all these phrases came to be a literal translation error. My final step was to create a guide for second language learners of German, and it contains the best practices for learning German as a second language learner. These are the documented findings I came across in my secondary research. I found out that Google Translate works as a brain, shuffling through its neural networks for best translations. Algorithms match translation through collected data. Google Translate has been designed to mimic the neurological functions of the brain. Translators feel as though that their contributions to the world are undervalued with the way machine translation operates. With Google Translate, European languages are more accurate than Asian languages. And language algorithms that Google Translate currently uses is constantly improved as the software is updated with additional text. These are the findings I came across in my primary research. Literal translations, errors in which translation is word for word. For this first example, schwamm drüber, Google Translate translates it as swam over it, but that is literal. The intended German context expresses one to forget about it. Interpretation differences, errors where Google Translate doesn't understand how a word is used in a specific context. For example, meine Familienmitglieder sind Einwanderer had been translated in English as my family members are immigrants, when in fact it is members of my family are immigrants. Tense errors, errors in which wrong tense of verbs are used. I flew translated to ich flog when it should be ich bin geflogen. Since this example uses the past tense, the German should translate in the perfect case. Based on the following types of errors, here are suggestions to keep in mind. Engage in language through culture, speak with natives, and center your learning around topics of interest. And at the end of my research, these are the reflections I came to understand. Dr. Lawrence, as a mentor, challenged me to think outside the box, which made me observe different perspectives. Along the way, I became more tech savvy. I realized this project demonstrated strengths and weaknesses of artificial intelligence that one may not normally observe. And if you're a second language learner, you must understand that Google Translate is prone to error. It is important that we do not defer to the technology. Thank you, everyone, and that concludes my summer research project. Does anybody have any questions?
I want to start by congratulating you. You did that in just under 6 minutes, which is really, I'm not saying that makes it a fantastic presentation. It was a great presentation anyway, but you made it on time. If you know anything about how academic conferences go, that is one of the hardest things presenters deal with, staying within the time. So you did it. That's great. So any questions? And you can put your questions in the comment box, and then I'll read them. And so let me see what we have here. A few congratulations. How did they come in? Okay, so one question I'll start with is, do you think Google Translate still has a place in learning languages or translating?
Personally, I believe it does within the academic fields because it's one of the resources that beginners first turn to. So it's a good start, but I don't believe it should be remained as a constant and something that a person should regularly use.
Okay. I have a follow-up to that, by the way, but I'm going to wait and see what other questions we get first. Oh, they're popping in. I've never done this before. I'm not quite sure where to start and when, where not to. Were you surprised by the errors that Google Translate made? Because you showed some very, I think those were great examples of mistakes that can be made, but were you surprised?
So before doing this research, these are errors I've already come in contact with. I just didn't know the name for it. So part of me wants to say I was surprised. Another part of me doesn't want to say that I'm surprised. Like for example, like when Google Translate uses the wrong case, that's something I've been exposed to just because most of my academics revolves around language studies. So I would say it's 50-50. I guess what really surprised me were more of the interpretation differences. That was something I really wasn't too exposed to.
Thank you. I'm just going to follow up with my own question. Did you use any words, German phrases or English phrases, or words that would have multiple definitions? And then how did Google Translate deal with that?
So yeah, we definitely use some words with multiple definitions. Specifically, one example, Schwamm drüber. That was uh, the definition that Google Translate gave us was to swim over it, but that's not the intended context with how you can use it and how that phrase was being intended to be perceived. So Google Translate kind of has a problem. It'll give like the most basic textbook definition if it has it for that specific phrase or word.
All right, great, thanks. I'm going to move to another question. So can you say more about the types of perspectives you and Dr. Lawrence discussed when you mentioned she encouraged you to look at a variety of perspectives? So what does this mean?
How we can use this technology to our best advantage. So that was a perspective I came to understand. Another perspective was how far we can push this artificial intelligence. What are the lengths that it will take to provide a translation, because it's quicker than human translation from record, but that doesn't always mean it's accurate.
So there's the error factor. that you have to account for. All right, important. But then it gives you some speed at the same time, but you have to be careful with what you get.
Right. You got to know when it's going wrong.
And how do you know that if you don't know the other language? That's right. That's a hard one. So another question, why did you choose Google Translate in particular for your studies? Are there others services that you might think you should have included?
I guess Google Translate, because it was the most world renowned. There was a lot of information out there to be found about it as well. So that definitely steered me towards using Google Translate. And the fact that Dr. Lawrence specializes in technology and artificial intelligence is definitely another key factor.
All right, good. All right, I'm going to move on to another question. How would you like to see Google Translate explained to beginning learners, since you suggest that it can still be a useful tool? So I'm imagining, I don't know, but I'm thinking, yeah, I mean, how can this be valuable to a beginner if there's all this room for error?
Well, I would tell the beginner that you should regard Google Translate for quick translations, simple things, not complicated terminology or terminology that has cultural context in it, because those sort of things Google Translate might be prone to error for. So just keeping it basic and simple is how I would sort of regard a beginner towards using Google Translate.
So it sounds like for say a tourist, right? Because I think a lot of tourists like to use something like Google Translate. It can be effective because you're not really getting into a deep conversation. You might be thinking directions or left or right or simple phrases, which it should be able to give you, but you're not going to have a philosophical discussion that way. All right, great. This one's coming from the Writing Center. That's great. So maybe it's not a real person. Does Google make these errors across other languages? And was there something different about the German language specifically?
So Google Translate does make these errors across different languages as well. Um, Specifically with German and Google Translate,
Yeah, right.
I guess one thing that stuck out to me is like the perfect case when you're talking in the past tense. It gets a little tricky there. It usually doesn't provide me accurate translations for the perfect case.
All right, good. What is a couple of people have asked a similar question, that is, what are your plans with this project in the future, if you have plans?
Yeah, so eventually I hope to get it published. Maybe someone can make some good use out of it. Hopefully, an undergraduate studying German as a beginner, they might be able to find the guide as useful. Someone who's already been through the requirements for the minor and kind of use this artificial intelligence at first as well. They can learn from my mistakes and better themselves off with the information that I've given through the guide.
All right, great, wonderful. Well, we're now at the end of our time for your segment. Thank you very much. That was really, fascinating. I'll just say that my wife is a translator, and
Cool.
at her, she's employed somewhere, and they constantly try using or pushing Google Translate. But what that means is that the translator still has to go back and look at the original. They end up being more language correctors than translators. So they still put
Okay.
time, but they're just correcting these difficult to translate phrases. All right, thank you, Isaiah. You set a high bar for everyone who comes after you. Um, so, and good luck, by the way, in getting your study published and what comes next. So now we'll move on to Preetam Gary, and I'll ask you to do the same. So I don't know, is your camera on? I can't tell. All right, I see your face. If you could turn your camera on, and Isaiah will turn his off, that'll help with our interpretation. And if you can tell what your major is, and then the name of your, the title of your research project, then I'm gonna start my clock, all right? So the floor is yours.
All right, sounds good. Hi, my name is Preetam Gary. I'm a philosophy and English secondary ed double major here at TU in my 4th year. The name of my project, it's quite long. It's Unpacking Philosophical Traditions, Opening Our Minds to Bridging the Gap, Analytic Philosophy and Continental Philosophy Through a Feminist Lens. So let me go ahead and screen share a quick little PowerPoint here. Let's see. Can y'all see? Okay, cool. So I kind of structured my PowerPoint the way that my paper is written. So it's kind of going to be going on a journey together through kind of how I went about my research and what I kind of gathered. It's kind of a non-concrete type of research. So you'll get what that means when I start talking. So let's just introduce the paper. I was talking to a friend a while ago, and we were talking about Bertrand Russell, and she said, I won't even talk about him because he's an analytic philosopher and I'm a continental philosopher. And it kind of blew my mind that she felt this kind of rift, right? That, you know, philosophy can't be a united whole. And so I thought that was just such an important attitude to dig into. Why do we feel this big divide? Why do we kind of have this sectioning of our field? So my goal was to kind of understand how that divide developed, and then kind of use a feminist lens to look at how it's kind of problematic to have that kind of a divide. And then I wanted to talk about different logics and how they kind of impact our perspectives in that divide. So the writers I mainly focused on were Jack Reynolds and James Chase, Peter Simmons, Val Plumwood, and Sarah Worley. Plumwood's paper actually inspired a large part of this. So let's just dive into what I'm even talking about when I say analytic and continental philosophy, right? So there's a general impression in the philosophical community as an undergrad that you just kind of gather, and it's that analytic philosophy values logic and the Western scientific method and this kind of very methodical approach to philosophy. And, you know, you often hear that they write like mathematicians, a lot of logicians happening here, right? And then we have continental philosophy, which tends to be more cultural. We hear this polarization where we say analytics write like mathematicians and continentals write like poets. So that's kind of the initial impression of the divide. So of course there are associated terms and ideas with each side that that we can kind of refer to. There's the Vienna Circle and logical positivism, which was just kind of a group of philosophers who talked about analytic ideas and kind of set the precedent for that area of philosophy. And then of course over in continental we have existentialism and phenomenology. So I'm trying to go a little bit quickly here. Let's talk about the different approaches to the divide to try to see what is the essence of what splits these people apart. Is it deeper than just an approach or a content? Where does this come from? So I mentioned the Vienna Circle, and so let's dig into the approaches. So Chase and Reynolds give us a geographical perspective. So, you know, is it that analytics are confined to one part of the world and continentals are from another? But that's not accurate because we have a lot of analytics coming from the side that they say continentals are from, and there's just a lot of mixing that makes it not even an accurate statement. So that's definitely not the way to go. And then the next idea is this kind of essentialist idea that we have what Chase and Reynolds call tribal alliances, right? Where we kind of polarize them. And, you know, he explains this as essentialism that ignores the internal diversity of each tradition and rather too quickly rules out all potential for engagement between them and is blind to places where there's crossover. So that's kind of reflective of that first impression I said that we get early in undergrad, right? That's this kind of polarized, clear-cut, two sides of the same coin kind of perspective. But the problem there is we don't really see how there's similarities and where there's crossovers. And the interesting thing about that is there are clear examples of people who are claimed by both sides. Ludwig Wittgenstein, his work is claimed by both sides. Analytic philosophers champion him as one of their key thinkers, but so do continentals. So it's definitely not an essential kind of essence difference that, you know, polarizes them so fundamentally, right? So then we get kind of the opposite idea. That's the deflationary perspective, where we say, you know what, maybe it's just a style thing, right? Writing like mathematicians or writing like poetry. But the problem with that is it doesn't talk about how the sides don't communicate, right? You would think that they could translate from one idea from math to poetry and poetry to math, but that's not really how it works. And there's a big divide, and there's like a kind of animosity there too that needs to be unpacked. So that perspective can't work either. So let's see. Okay, yeah. So there's kind of a lot of perspectives. There's a historical approach also that speaks about how the divide came to be and if it was inevitable. And the general idea there is that it was not. This paper is quite long, so I'm trying to condense it a bit. So I mentioned the Vienna Circle. There's also this idea that my mentor and I call it philosopherents, right? So people who pass down their ideas to the people they teach. And we have to be really careful, because we can't just blindly take our ideas from the people who teach us and perpetuate a divide that doesn't need to be there anymore, right? So the last thing I wanted to mention on this slide was politics. Part of the divide from that historical event was the idea that if you wrote philosophy in a way that wasn't mathematical, you could be trying to hide some kind of evil ideology. And that's a huge kind of perpetuator of the analytic discrediting of continentals. But of course, like, we can see the danger in that kind of narrow-mindedness and bad nature of assumption, right? So the reason why I use feminism as a lens here, right? I realized, okay, we need to narrow this down and have a focus. So feminism is something that is shared between both sides, right? So it's clearly not a content area difference. So what is the difference between analytic feminists and continental feminists? So one is the type of logic. So analytic feminists are going to argue that formal scientific logic isn't innately an oppressive force for feminism, and continentals will kind of take a separate view. And this is kind of where Plumwood talks about these ideas of objectivity, negation, and dualism, right? So when we have this idea of P and not P, let me make sure. Yeah, so we can kind of move on. So when we have this idea of P and not P, right? This is a very fundamental idea of logic and philosophy. There's P and then there's what is not P. The problem here is it's only framing not P in terms of P, right? And we see that in feminism as woman in terms of men, right? So there's this fundamental conception in the way we do logic that discredits a certain group, right? So there's a way that analytic philosophy can be wielded in this kind of evil way, right? The way that we can use logic in this evil way. But that's not to say the logic itself is flawed, because P and not P are just a way of identifying each other, right? You could always swap them. You could say A and B and A, right? So we definitely shouldn't reject all of formal logic. And this leads us to the idea that there are different logics for different times. So maybe part of the difference is that some analytic philosophers use formal logic and other continental philosophers use alternative logics like paraconsistent logic, right? So I've got some notes here. Going faster than I expected, but also somehow slower than I expected. So yeah, so we get to this idea of paraconsistent logic, and the fundamental idea is that we can have P and not P and not have a problem with that, which is like this huge explosion that happens in formal logic, right? Like, how could you possibly say it's raining and it's not raining? But if we just make more options, right? If we think of it as A and B, right? And what is P and what is not P as P, and then everything that isn't P, but it isn't implied by the lack of P. I hope that made sense. It's kind of a lot of like philosophy logic jargon happening. But basically what I'm getting at is there are a lot of different logics that we can have with different kinds of values and systems. And we can talk more about that if you're interested. So let's get to bridging the gap. So what do we want to do about all this. One is we need to get rid of that kind of animosity, right? We need to try to argue to learn rather than fight to win. And then, of course, there's a social issue of feminism. And when formal logic is wielded in a way that can be oppressive, we need to just kind of critically assess how we're using all of our philosophy. And of course, educating young students about the divide. Like, clearly, I've just scratched the surface of this whole thing, right? And there's so much more jam-packed into this than what I've said in my paper, and so much more in the philosophical community than is in my paper. So it's a huge conversation to not talk about early on. So this is a kind of conversation that we need to start early. I hope all that made sense.
I have to do the indelicate thing and say, you have like 1 minute to finish.
Okay, yeah. So that's basically kind of the summary of it. I had some works cited here. I wanted to give you guys my contact info. If you want to take a quick screen cap, I could share the paper. We could start a dialogue. I also wanted to say a special thanks to Professor Georgevich, who is my mentor, and URCI, of course, for giving us this awesome opportunity to delve into this. Because that was my point, right? That undergrads should be talking about this divide earlier on. So I was really privileged to get to look into this and really devote time to it.
Thank you. And you know, given that I said you had 1 minute left, you did a really wonderful wrap up in a minute. See, it's doable. Thank you very much. That was fascinating. And when I was listening to you, I was thinking of a couple of things, but I think we'll first open it up to questions before I say anything. So your first question comes from Professor Georgevich, and her question is, how would you characterize your paper, your research, your writing? Analytic, continental, both?
Yeah, I love this question because it's impossible almost to do philosophy without putting yourself in one, right? So I might be perpetuating the divide in my own writing style. I definitely think my habit leans towards analytic because that's what I feel like I've been taught about the most. And I definitely think that reflects our education system, right? That we have these classes. We have a class called analytic philosophy, actually, and I don't believe Towson offers one called continental philosophy, which is interesting. But yeah, I'm trying to open my mind to different logics, but the one I'm most comfortable with is that good old, analytic, mathematical, concrete, unyielding, fact neutral logic. So I definitely say I'm on that analytic side, but of course it gets more complicated than that when you try to be an ethical philosopher and an aware, kind of non-ignorant philosopher.
So a follow-up question to that, what you just said is, why do you think the philosophy department doesn't teach both?
I think they definitely teach both, just in not a clearly labeled way. So, for example, you could take a class called existentialism or a class called phenomenology, and these are kind of core ideas within continental philosophy, right? So Towson definitely has a diverse teaching of a lot of different fields, but it's an interesting discussion about labels that I kind of wanted to focus on, was like, how do I not know what exactly continental philosophy is until I do research on it?
All right. We have another question, and the question is the P and not P example relevant to only the analytic group? How would continental philosophers think about it?
Yeah. So in analytic philosophy, in our good old formal mathematical Western logic, we think of P and not P in terms of it's raining or it's not raining, right? So it would never make sense to say it's raining and it's not raining. That doesn't make any sense. But then when we look at a different way to look at that same logic, we could say, well, what if we label one A and the other one B? Well, then they're not relative to each other, right? It's just raining and then, state, like state A, state B, right? We don't even have to, why can't raining be the neutral, right? And then we would say, like, it's not, I don't even know how to phrase that because it's so like contradictory to how we speak, but I hope that's making sense. The idea is to think of the two pieces independently rather than relative to each other, and then still use your formal logic in a way that kind of respects both sides in an objective kind of way. And there's a lot more to this, of course. There's a lot of jargon and quotes that I had in the paper. You can have P and not P, but you could also have not P and P, and not P and not P, and not P and not P. So I guess it's just about how you frame it. I hope that made sense.
So I one more question, and this will be the last question, and this is, so what was the most profound or important thing that you learned from the sources you read?
Yeah.
Gotta keep that really concise.
Yeah, no. So, and I strangely enough have a concise answer, even though the whole thing was super important to me. There was a specific quote I will find actually for you that just absolutely blew my mind, about the politics driving this divide and that historical context that pushes us. And it's that idea that I mentioned of continentals writing poetically because they're trying to sneak in some kind of evil in their writing and act like they're a philosopher, but secretly impact society. Like, it was just such a nefarious attitude. And the quote I wanted to mention was, analytic resistance, this is from a paper with an awesome title, in the future philosophy will be neither continental nor analytic but synthetic, and this was a paper by Ian Thompson, and he says analytic resistance to continental philosophy continues to take the form of opposition to any style that seems to be deliberately obscure. So the function of such obscure styles is to conceal fascism or Nazism hidden at their core. So that's what
Wow.
stuck with me. I think that
You're
there's
ending on a relevant topic of conspiracy. That was really, that really struck me earlier in your presentation. Unfortunately, we're out of time. So I'm just gonna first thank you. Thank you for a lovely presentation and really bringing, philosophy to the front and center, which I think a lot of people aren't so comfortable. I mean, you philosophers are, but not non-philosophers. And I think you did that very nicely. I do want to tell you and everyone else listening that there are more questions than I'm able to answer. So I'm hoping that we can save these questions, and then not today, but next week, I can share them with each of the presenters, okay? All right, thank you very much, Preetam, great job. And then we'll move right to our next speaker, and our next speaker is, let's see, can I see you? Who our next speaker is? Well, on my list, it's Alina Howell. And I'm looking for you right now. I think I hear you.
Hello.
Oh, hi. Okay, now I see you.
Hello.
Hi, thank you. Nice to meet you. And Alina, Alina's faculty advisor was Professor Eric Ropers, and I should, again, repeat what you've already heard, but gratitude to all of the faculty who worked with all of the students presenting today. It's really a labor of, I think, love for all of the faculty, and and hopefully, the students also feel the great benefit of that too. So I'm going to start my clock. If you could tell your major and then the title of your project. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, my name is Alina Howell, and my major is, I have three. I'm an international studies major, a history major, and an interdisciplinary studies major with a track in Asian studies. And my project is called Searching for the Spirit of Korean Identity. And I will share my screen. Okay, just let me know if you can see it. Okay.
Yes, we can.
So my project was about the oh, I'm sorry, I have this, the last one. My project was about looking into the connection between Korean literature and the Korean identity during the era of colonization of the Korean Peninsula. So I came to research this topic due to my exposure to short story literature being used to analyze a time period in a Chinese history course. And so I became interested in short story literature being used as an outlet for people during that time period to explain their personal feelings and display their understanding of the events occurring around them. So my own personal interest in Korea and my interest in history combined with this newfound interest in short story literature led me to want to research what connections there would be with Korean national identity and short story literature. So while reading a little over 90 or so short stories, their major themes were as follows. So women, daily life, politics, suffocation and anxiety, friendships, marriage, and war. Of course, each story would contain a combination of more than just one of these major themes. So I did have overlap between them, but the stories at most covered 3 of these major themes significantly. And while the major themes of these stories were important to note, these factors that I have listed here as well, more external factors, were also vital to understanding how each story could be placed in that time and its particular significance while analyzing each story. So for each of them, I considered the time period, the national leadership, the gender of the author, socioeconomic status of the author, as well as the age of the author. And all of these factors would influence the author's viewpoint of their written products, these short stories. And this intersection between literary factors and these external factors allowed me to understand not only the context of each story, but more deeply how they were connected. Okay. So here I have a short excerpt from the story Fire by Hyun Ching-on. In this story, a young girl has been sold off to live with her much older husband and his mother. And in the excerpt, it describes her first night in her new home, and you can follow along as I read. So, after a time, she was able to open her eyes, heavy with nightmares. Then she saw her husband's face like the lid of a rice kettle above her own. His dark face, as large as a round wooden tray, blended into the surrounding darkness, but the glaring whites of his eyes, the half-open lips strewn with beads of saliva, the yellowish teeth laid bare by the crooked grin, these she could discern clearly. Overwhelmed by the terror rising from her navel and the pain twisting her bowels, Suni now trembled, now floundered, fighting the persistent sleepiness that seized her by the nape of her neck. Finally, she realized what happened. So in this portion of the story, the young girl Suni experiences a sexual assault from her husband. Due to her age, she does not completely comprehend what is going on until the end. Following this experience, she does attempt to flee her home and her husband and his mother, and she finally succeeds when she burns down the home. So on the right is the author of the story, Hyun Ching-on. He was educated in Tokyo and Shanghai before returning back to Korea. He published the story in 1925 in the Kbyuk, or Creation magazine, at age 25. So how does this information help to better analyze the story in its entirety? Well, knowing that he was educated abroad would indicate that he would most likely have some sort of higher economic standing, either during his younger life or afterwards. And also the story was published in 1925, meaning that it was published after the March 1st movement, which in Korea, there were mass protests from the Korean people against the Imperial Japanese government. So the movement in turn led to the loosening of restrictions on Korean culture and life, which included literary magazines, which like the Creation, which Hyun had published the story in. So with all of these outside factors in mind, along with the contents of the story, I was able to discern that perhaps Hyun was bringing attention to unfortunate circumstances of young brides sold in the countryside areas of Korea. Or maybe that's too on the surface. So maybe more deeply, he's using the girl's situation of being trapped and attempting to escape as a representation of what the Korean people were going through as a colony under Japanese rule. This sort of cross analysis is what I've done for the majority of the stories that I have read. So, for example, briefly in The Traitor, it discusses how the once idolized Korean nationalist Lee Kwang-soo became known as a collaborator with the Japanese government. In Cranes by Hwang Sun-won, it depicts the struggles of a split Korea where they are expected to turn against each other in the wake of the spread of communism that would eventually lead to the Korean War and the subsequent division of Korea into North and South Korea. And then A Society That Drives You to Drink discusses the mental decline of those who felt helpless in making substantial change in their life and work situations. In all of these, the themes and messages shared by the authors varied and reflected each of their concerns, interests, and interests as pertaining to Korean society and the life and the situation that they were going through, which could be termed as a collective Korean identity. I just wanted to thank you all for listening. And I wanted to thank my advisor, Dr. Ropers, for guiding and supporting me through the research process. And I'd like to thank the CLA Summer Research Grant for giving me the opportunity to read over 150 stories to do all this in-depth research. And I can take questions.
Well, thank you very much. And you also have come in under time, which is great. I don't know if I should say this, but I've been in this role in many conferences, on many conference panels. It's one of my favorite roles because I get to use the clock as my defense. But I don't have to right now, so that's really good. We'll open it up to questions. And I have a question of my own, if you don't mind me asking. So I'm wondering if you also looked at publishers of these stories and know anything about the audiences. And audience reception is hard. I know I worked on this, but do you have any sense of that?
Well, a lot of them were published in literary magazines that were being monitored by the Imperial Japanese government. Depending on the time, it would explain how strict they were in cutting things out or allowing things to go through. But most of the people that were reading them would usually have been educated as well. So their audience was more of a educated class, but I don't think at this point that the regular like proletariat class of people were able to read these things.
Sure.
So
no, that makes sense. I mean, levels of literacy especially are important. We have a few questions. I'm going to start with the first one. And the first one is, can you talk a little bit about the criteria that you used to pick the stories that you studied? So how did you choose these?
So I actually needed stories. It was actually very hard to find translated Korean short stories. Usually they're translated like monographs, like full books, but there's not a lot of them that are short stories. So I kind of gathered everything that I could. And then once I read through them, I classified them in the sections that I had shown by like thematics and then by external factors, which I had shown on my slides.
All right, thank you. So then the next question is, this person is saying, I wonder what the spirit of Korean identity is that you can detect from or ascertain from those stories.
For myself, I saw that there was a lot of, it seemed like a lot of struggle to be free. And then a lot of pride in being Korean as well. So wanting to go against and doing what would be the best for the people, not just the government, but for the actual people to live, I guess, yeah, just freely in liberation, because the time period that I did look at was the colonial period, mostly. So that's kind of the feeling that I got while reading a lot of these, was that a lot of them felt trapped and wanted to be allowed to express themselves.
Sure. Okay, I'm going to ask you a related question. So when you talked about Korean identity, did you get a sense of regional identity, north, south, or anything else, any other way of thinking about local identities?
No, so there wasn't really a divide then. The divide happened, I guess when the ideas of like communism were introduced, and that was after Korean liberation in 1945. And so once those ideas of communism was introduced and then became more popular amongst the people, that was when there were more stories, I guess you could say, discussing like a difference in the two Koreas, because, or like how the conflict, the inner conflict that Korea was experiencing, but within itself, because there were two opposing ideologies emerging at that time.
Okay, all right, great, thank you. And so the next question is for the authors that you selected, the authors who collaborated with Japan, how did they justify their support of the colonial regime?
So the authors that were classified as collaborators, they were called collaborators from what I found in my research because they either worked with the Japanese government, like without, like they were in full support of the Japanese government, or they were instead more like a bystander. So being a bystander and allowing things to happen, and saying that it was to help Korea in the long run, instead of being with the more popular idea of liberation, would classify someone as a collaborator because they weren't fighting for the freedom of Korea. They were still allowing Korea to be colonized and kept under the control by Imperial Japan.
Okay, thank you. One more question. This will be your last question. And that is, how did you decide on the short stories as your quote unquote unit in your research? And this person is saying it's a really clever research design.
Yes, so short stories are, I chose them because I wouldn't have to read a full like 200, 300 page book and multiple of them. So I'd get to see a span of a lot of different authors at a lot of different points in their lives with different education, different experiences, and then they would also use that to write their own stories, which would have different themes. And the short stories are no more than like 20 pages, so it's easy to read like 10 or 20 within like 1 week, as opposed to reading like 10 or 20 books over the time that I had. So
thank you. That's a really important observation you made there about the use of time, because that is how researchers, they have to be constantly aware of limiting their projects so that they can get them done. Oh, that's great. Thank you very much. And we're going to move on to the next presenter, okay? And while we're moving virtually to the next presenter, I would like to just throw out a PSA right now, and that is that I think that's a common, right, expression, but maybe not everyone knows that. But public service announcement that the college will be also giving out money for student summer research this year. So the deadline for that is the second Friday in March. So if any of our listeners are interested, you have time to put together your proposal. And I believe that information is on our college website if you look for it. But if not, ask your professor and they can help you with that. All right, thank you. And so I believe I am going to Carmen Jones. Do I see Carmen?
Hi.
Hi, Carmen. All right, welcome. So Carmen, as with everyone else, I'm going to ask you to begin by telling your major, or if you have more than one, of course, and then your faculty advisor was Professor Carrie Grant. So tell your major and then the title of your project.
Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Carmen Jones, and my major is international studies, and I have a minor in political science. I actually have two titles for my project because they changed like halfway through. So I'm gonna explain that really quickly. Um, can you see? Yeah, it should be here. Okay.
Yes, yeah.
So my research this past summer involved working with a nonprofit organization called Family Survivor Network Incorporated in West Baltimore, with the guidance of Dr. Grant. Originally titled Mending Baltimore Community Relations, Survivors of Violence and Social Injustice, I had originally planned on investigating the barriers of witness intimidation. Um, on survivors within the city and how FSN can use its platform to combat these barriers. Um, but with continued communication and development, this is, of course, a really sensitive subject. So it is now an ongoing project that I'm working or continuing to work with FSN and my professor this semester. So what I submitted and what I will be talking about today is a report called There's Healing Happening Here, Reimaging Community Health and Wellness. So my research question was what does community health care look like in West Baltimore, and how can FSN use its resources to better provide for their members? So FSN members are people who have lost a loved one to gun violence, homicide, people who have gone through really traumatic experiences. So FSN provides a multitude of different services to help these individuals with their healing, and it's completely voluntary. So the main topic of my report is holistic health. And for FSN, using the apothecary approach provides innovative, easily accessible herb and medicine uses to help minor health problems. For example, turmeric or thyme for aches and pains. I think this was, I hate to say it, pandemic was awful, but this is a really good topic during a pandemic because, of course, underserved communities have a variety of um, different factors that play a role into some of the struggles and challenges that they face. So on top of maybe economic and political factors that hold these people back in, difficult situations, being within a pandemic, it's extremely awful to, see the high rates of COVID in such small areas, and not having easily accessible resources like the hospital, clinic. So being able to create this report was really important. Um, so to continue, one of the most craziest things that there is not much research on this topic, local and nationally. So a lot of the research I did, which I'll talk a little bit about later, was more so connected to institutionalized racism, especially in the medical field. So two pieces of evidence that I have is we can look to the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis, as well as Henrietta Lacks' cell line, which has been so foundational in the medical field. And we can look to this as mistrust in the Black community for the medical field, and also, of course, not having the resources or the accessibility. One of the things that I thought was really cool in my research, I found out that the Young Lords and the Black Panthers also look to holistic health as a way to bring health within the Black community when during the civil rights movement, it wasn't easily accessible to not just only Black, but many minorities. So second finding was traditional health versus holistic health. So traditional health, you go to the hospital or you go to the clinic for a specific reason. You usually go and your doctor says, well, what's wrong? And you tell them and they're going to give you a general response, medication or antibiotics for whatever you're going there for. With holistic health, it's more about the individual as a whole, and you can respond with more holistic, um, like plant or herb for specific uses. And it's more so up to the individual to take into why their body is doing certain things. And it's the physical and it's the mental and it's emotional. So I think being aware of both is incredibly important. It's not just, I'm not trying to say that holistic health is the ultimate alternative, because if you get in a accident or you're, I don't know, you're pregnant, like you need to go to the hospital, like you need that. But outside of like major issues, being able to take a tea for a stomach ache or headache is much easier than having to go to the clinic every time you need it. So that's just one of the things FSN does, is uses holistic medicine and brings that awareness to their community members. So yes, so holistic health is a great alternative to minor health problems to underserved communities. This report was a great resource for FSN and their members to provide insight from historical context of institutionalized racism in the medical field, as well as bring an informative health approach about taking care of yourself and being able to be aware that there are other sources of health related practices that you can use if you can't go to the clinic or you can't go to the hospital for minor health problems. And this was a great experience for me. I gained working with a nonprofit, advancing my writing and research skills, and enhancing the knowledge that I already have from Towson in my college career, enhancing like well, it was online, but more so an in-person, person-to-person relation with people who are working with members of the community every single day and are seeing the impact, rather than me just learning it from a lecture. So to have both this has been really amazing. So I would quickly like to thank Dr. Carrie Grant and Dr. Sosha Stuckey, as well as Family Survivor Network, Dorian Walker and Pam Stein, that have helped my journey through this research process. And if you have any, if you want to support or donate or just look at FSN's webpage, it's fsnwork.org, and they just updated it, and it's really, really nice. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you. And also, I want to commend you on timing. That's great. So I will start with, of course, the first question. And the first question is, do you think FSN's model can be replicated elsewhere?
Oh yeah, no, I think there are a lot of organizations over the nation that are doing things like this. FSN is quite small, but they do make quite an impact. I think it would be really cool to have like what they do, not just in America, but in like Latin America, I think, and to provide to underserved communities. And that's kind of like why I've been so happy to have this experience, because I do want to work internationally, and to be able to do things like this for communities that need it is super important.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, hold on. This person is saying, I wonder how this experience was for you, and if you think that you will integrate it in your future work. I think you just indicated that, but could you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, so I do like writing, and I didn't really realize my love for writing until I had this experience. I do want to work with nonprofits, specifically international nonprofits, and I want to work in human rights and basically kind of be a voice for communities that don't have a voice, especially in terms of resources that they could need from an international globalist perspective.
Great, thank you. I wanted, you said something earlier, you said a lot of interesting things, but one of the things that you you referred to early on was how in some ways the pandemic brought something useful, maybe even positive to your work. And I think more your findings even. I think that's okay to say. The pandemic has been really tragically hard and difficult for, I think, most of us.
Yeah.
But there are certain things unexpectedly that came out of it that were also quite good. And I think your connection, connecting your topics to the history of institutional racism. You mentioned the Tuskegee study and then the Henrietta Lacks case. I think that's really, important. It's very relevant, of course, today in how different communities are approaching the vaccination, for example. So I think this is really great to be able to show that connection. All right. I'll go on to another question. And can you talk a little bit about FSN's goal with the witness intimidation study, and how does this project connect to that future work?
That's a great question. So basically, of course, working with survivors of gun violence, homicide, really traumatic experiences, to be able to work in witness intimidation, it's a very big problem in Baltimore because, of course, it's kind of that thing like you don't snitch, you don't tell on, what's going on, and because it's because everyone knows everyone, it's very hard to be upfront or tell the truth. And then, if you do having being intimidated as an individual or even your family, it's a really difficult thing to address, which I think is why it's taken us quite long to develop it. So as far as the report goes and FSN's goal, if we can create this report, it'll be able to kind of bring awareness, first of all, to the community as well as like the outside community, and hopefully like the city in terms of politics and policies and lawyers and the justice system, as well as hopefully provide an like safety outline for individuals, so they know that if they're being intimidated, there are resources that they can go to or use in case they are intimidated. So it's a big project, but I think it's super important because it's a big problem, but it's kind of like I don't know how to explain, like overthrown, like not really explained. There hasn't been much written on it either, or awareness for it. So I hope that explained that well enough.
No, that's great. And as you are talking and we're talking, just not answering the question, I could think of so many other similar, communities around the country that, like I said earlier, I don't know if you heard, but I'm from Chicago, and right, it's the same thing there. It's the idea is you must be quiet. You do not tell on anyone else, and then if you do, the consequences are pretty severe. But how do you break that, right?
Yeah.
So, well, you're getting a congratulatory message without any question in it. But in any case, it appears that we're at the end of our question and actually just about at the end of your time. So thank you for your presentation, Carmen.
Thank you.
I think you're the last person who's presenting today. I just want to say a few general wrap-up comments and observations. And first of all, I want to thank again all of the presenters for really a wonderful job. I hope you feel that it was not only worth it, but hopefully not too stress-inducing. But the more practice you get, often the easier it is to get up and make these types of presentations. You all did really wonderfully. I appreciate your use of technology. That's really important too. That's coordination of several different skills at one time, and you did it really well. I think that for everyone else listening today, and we have quite a few listeners and viewers, you can see how talented CLA students are and the variety of talents in these 4 different presentations today. We had a 5th presentation, but unfortunately the presenter couldn't appear, just so you know about that. I think also what impresses me at least is that your work has, all of your work has a theoretical side, and all of your work, even the work in philosophy, has practical applications. And I think that's really, important to do because we do need to look into the theoretical, but then how does that relate to our, everyday life or everyday reality? If it's in the past, in the past, right? And you did that really well. And in a way that was engaging and interesting. I should tell you that each of you has had multiple congratulations from people in the audience and saying that they appreciate how hard you worked and how well you did with your presentation. So I'm very glad that you all joined this afternoon on this wintry Friday afternoon, late in the day on the eve of the beginning of the weekend. I appreciate that. And I, again, want to thank everyone for joining, and particularly our presenters and their faculty advisors. So we're done a little bit early. I don't know if that's a problem for anybody. So enjoy the weekend, be safe, and make sure you get a little break, work hard too. All right. Have a good week.